Well, originally I think we were going to have a panel with Prometric and Pearson VUE, but due to some scheduling constraints Mike had, it's a little bit of the Pearson VUE show. So today's topic is about online proctoring or remote proctoring, as it was called out in our agenda for today. And Peter Pascale is our Senior Director of Product Management. He oversees all the different product portfolio that we have for our testing business. And I've had the pleasure to work with Peter for a number of years. He's really a bright guy, and we gave this presentation actually in Budapest, or sort of a variant of it, and it got a lot of questions. So there's a good bit of material in Peter's presentation, but feel free to ask questions if you have them. I think I learned that we're the only item on the agenda today, so we have about 1 hour. Is that all right, guys? 1 hour?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, Jessica, I understand you're going to drive the slide deck for us, so I think Peter's ready to get going without further ado.
Okay, great. Let me pull that up for you.
Okay.
Great, and I'll just, while you're doing that, just jump in a little bit of background. And like Clarke said, we want the questions and discussion. I even kind of planned not to fill the whole hour with my slides, so hopefully if you have a question and don't get it in during, we'll have some time at the end. Being billed as an intelligent guy by Clarke is a pretty good compliment coming from somebody so strong in our industry and pretty astute himself. I'm Peter Pascale. I'm the Senior Director for Product Management at Pearson VUE, which means that my teams are responsible for short-term and long-term direction for our products, both kind of what we're building today, but also what the market and what our customers require tomorrow and into the future. The intent today is to provide a little bit of an overview for remote proctoring or online proctoring with the idea of giving you a better sense of the landscape, how people are using it, what factors you'd consider. This is not meant to be, and we had I think, a good agreement with Prometric going in. It's not meant to be a Pearson VUE specific view. We're trying to kind of take a step back and give you a little bit more of the context that you would use in any scenario with any vendor that you were considering using this type of assessment delivery for. A quick clarification on the titling. We had started a while back with the terminology remote proctoring, but we've shifted to use online proctoring primarily because we just see that's the way the industry has been heading. Microsoft and others refer to it this way. If you go to conferences and look at how other programs, speaking about it, other credentialing programs, but also other vendors, they tended to start to adopt or gravitate to this terminology. So that just a subtle difference there, but something worth pointing out. So you can go to the next slide. I think we try to talk about remote proctoring or online proctoring in the context of how you might be considering expanding the delivery models that you want to support. So go to the next slide. And essentially, this is about supporting flexibility or more models for assessment delivery than what we've done historically in our industry. Historically, we've been focused more around traditional test centers or some sort of controlled testing environment where you can see on the spectrum on the bottom, we're providing control and security. But increasingly, we see a desire for alternative delivery models that balance control and security with access and convenience. How can we create models that support more ways of delivering the exam? So next slide. And essentially, regardless of a vendor, there's sort of a spectrum, a way of think about how our industry is starting to revisit where and how assessments are delivered. So the same scale is present here, the balance of control and security with access and convenience. And on the left-hand side at the top, you see items that are historically been a part of our industry, test center focused, typically managed by a vendor. But you see increasingly as you move across the spectrum, a number of interesting new models for delivery. So you not only might you have test centers, but you also are starting to see the interest in live online proctoring. In other words, the proctor is remotely proctoring the test delivery through IBT or internet-based testing. Unproctored delivery of tests for certain types of self-assessments or practice. And then also across the bottom, models that are often provided by vendors but are create a little bit more sponsor control are models like observational testing, client-operated test centers, client-proctored browser-based delivery, as well as unproctored IBT record and review. And we're gonna dive into some of the ones here that kind of give online proctoring a little more focus. If you go to the next slide, essentially what we're focusing on for this presentation is online proctoring, but we want to give a little context. What's consistent about what we're talking about is that typically a proctor is present. Now we'll talk about cases where a proctor isn't present, but just to kind of think, to give you the context, this is how we think about how testing expands outside of the test centers in these two models. So let's go to the next slide.
So Peter, the use case here is really someone is in a little tiny town in Montana where there isn't a testing center, and they're going to take a testing experience maybe at their dining room table and still have it proctored.
Right.
And so they'll be at home, they're in some location where it's really hard to get to a testing center, and they just want to do it right from their living room.
Right.
As our CEO would say, in their pajamas.
In their pajamas, pajama testing. Exactly. And we'll talk about some of the other factors, but candidate access is a key one that drives this. But just to give some context for online proctoring, we actually see a number of models emerging where a proctor is still important, even if the test center isn't. So the first is client-proctored browser-based delivery. This is where there's live proctoring being done by an in-person proctor that the client manages. We see a number of programs doing this with maybe a couple different scenarios. Either they're running their own training programs or training centers, they're doing assessment at events, or they have some other reason where they can bring a candidate and a proctor together, and the proctor provides that control. They provide the security and they provide the control of so on. But it's not necessarily, it's actually not in the test center. It's a more flexible form of testing that gives a lot of flexibility to the sponsor program. And I think if Prometric were here, they would talk a little bit about how they do this with Prime and with some of their models. So this is not a view specific, but this is a model that's kind of gaining some momentum. And you can see some of the properties listed here. It's browser-based delivery. The client's managing the proctors. The client or the proctor arranges the delivery environment and equipment. You're not dependent on a test center, and you have more flexibility for what equipment is used. A lot of times it's the candidate's own laptops. And the proctor's private codes and the proctor's credentials unlock the exam for delivery, and then they monitor it on site. We can do photo capture and some basic biometrics. Typically, you'll see that as part of the solutions in industry. And the device is locked down and the exam is launched in a secure browser. Very common across our industry. The idea, in other words, that while you're taking this exam, you can't go and browse Google for answers. You can't go and use a chat program to chat your friends. Very common approach. So
Yeah.
go to the next slide. Now, with this client-proctored IBT, what I was just referring to, that's where the proctor is in person. But the one that's kind of our focus for today is online proctoring, where live proctoring is provided, but it's provided by a remote proctor. The proctor actually isn't in person with the candidate, but they're monitoring the candidate remotely through a set of technologies that are facilitated by webcams, telephony, voice over IP, and so on, as well as the proctor having control over the candidate's delivery experience. So again, this is browser-based delivery, and folks may ask, why is that? Can you deliver this without an internet connection? And in both of these models, the browser-based delivery is what's providing the flexibility, and it's also providing the proctor, obviously, the ability to watch in real time. Remote proctoring software runs locally on the candidate equipment, something that they may have downloaded through their browser. Most solutions that you would see out in the market provide a photo and potentially ID capture. So you can create some sort of admissions or ID verification protocol, very common. Video and test session information is typically stored in some sort of central proctoring system for audit and review after the fact. And like the previous solution, the device is locked down, the exam is launched in a secure browser, so the proctor knows that the candidate can't be chatting or searching Google while they're doing this. This is online proctored, and this is kind of the core of our topic. But let's contrast this. So go to the next slide. Let's contrast this a little bit with another flavor of online proctor, or that tends to get called out when people are talking about online proctoring. There is something called record and review, which is also a remote proctoring kind of model that people have been utilizing and exploring. And let's just contrast the two. They're both valid. I'm not trying to set one up as the good guy and one as the bad guy. In the record and review, there is no human watching the exam. There is no proctor. The exam is just recorded for auditing post-exam. And that is typically done with, a lot of times vendors will provide some auditing software capabilities so that you can randomly select exams to go back and look at what was happening, was there any evidence of cheating or tampering or so on. The similarities between these two, and when you talk to folks within our industry, they'll often lump both of these models within online proctor. Which I think is okay, but for a terminology difference between online proctored versus record and review, let's just kind of talk about their different properties. The similarities are it's both browser-based delivery. Both are leveraging remote proctoring software on the candidate system. Video is a central storage system, and oftentimes photo and ID can be captured. The fundamental difference is that live professional proctors are present in the online solution. They are monitoring the exam delivery. They can communicate with the candidate. They can ask the candidate to stop doing suspicious behavior and even shut the exam down. And that's not true in record and review proctoring. Also, in both of these solutions, there tends to be varying abilities for post-session review, and that's just based on the vendor and the software capabilities they're providing. What we advocate is the sponsor programs would match the solution to the assessment need. Both of them are valid. Because of that, you'll often find vendors like ourselves who support both of these models. But it's important to call this out because they're not apples to apples comparison. And sometimes you can find that people are offering capabilities of one model, like they say record and review, but but you have to be clear that you don't get the features of the live human proctor. So you pick the right kind of model for your program. And we'll talk in the second part about what some of the factors are that represent how you make those choices. But this is a natural pause. You can go to the next slide, and you can see this is the second part of the presentation. And I'll pause for questions or any other comments.
Yeah. So Peter, I jumped the gun a little bit when I talked about my pajama testing example, but it seems like we've looked at 3 scenarios so far. And in the way we're thinking about it, each of the scenarios, the underpinning is that you are connected to the internet while you take the test. That's really critical. In the way we're thinking about it, in one model, the use case might be at a conference where you just you have some proctors available that are part of your team, and they match up with some people that want to take the test, and they're taking the test online, and they're observed in person by a proctor. That was kind of your use case 1.
Yep.
Use case number 2 looked like my Montana example. And what I gleaned from this is you have to make an appointment ahead of time because you need to pair the proctoring capability real time but online while the person takes the test. So in use case 2, it's at some remote location, not in a testing center, with an appointment and monitored real time by a proctor over the internet. So 2 things happening in the internet in that case. 1, the test is being delivered, and 2, the proctoring is being delivered online as well with the help of some biometrics and camera technology that would be available to the test taker. And the third scenario is, again, taking the test online anywhere you want, and having a slightly, I'm going to call it a different security protocol, but just having that session recorded, maybe still using a camera and the audio and just having a look at what's going on there. So if you are suspicious, later you might go review that tape. Maybe you got some data forensics that said that the test looked odd to you, so you might look at it for that reason, or you might look at everyone later, or you might randomly select some and look at them. So,
Exactly.
so 3 scenarios: at a remote location with a live proctor, at a remote location delivered real time with a online proctor, and a third case, which is a record and review later approach. So the common theme, all connected.
Yes, brilliant. Good summary.
I'm learning.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here with you today. I totally missed that first one.
Yeah. Well, and the point for us is these are interesting ways in which testing is moving outside of the test center.
Right. So, you know, when we got started in the computer-based testing industry, and I have to admit, you know, I was one of the founders of Prometric. Our big idea, which has really been pervasive through all the strategies, has been making testing really convenient and removing that barrier to the test administration process so that we can get more adoption. And I think these are just more tools in our toolbox now enabled by the internet. You can basically test anywhere at any time using one of these various methodologies.
Absolutely. There's probably no questions after that.
I don't know, it was a general commercial for the whole industry.
Yeah, but no, that was a great summary. Is there any other questions or things that we can clarify about these models before we drop into how you evaluate them?
Come on, Chuck, you always have a question.
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's go on then. We're going to focus in now on online proctoring, which is the scenario where the proctor is present, but you don't have a the exam is proctored remotely. You don't have a live proctor present in the room with the candidate. And within here, we'll sort of talk about some of the factors that might make record and review appropriate. So first, though, some things that are driving the interest in online proctoring. We see this across our industry. We see it in the educational market as well. Candidates want this flexibility. They're increasingly connected. They have the capabilities to support online proctoring. They have the equipment to support it. They're in an office that has a decent enough laptop, for example. And they find test centers inconvenient. Internet delivery is another advance that our industry has had for a number of years, but it's really supporting some interesting flexibility again, device flexibility. We can deliver on different types of personal computers and laptops. We even have the ability to deliver on tablets, even on mobile, but in many cases the mobile screen is kind of not so conducive to a medium or higher stakes assessment. But nevertheless, you get the flexibility to deliver on more devices than ever before. We also see that internet-based testing is enabling diverse assessment types. You can bring different types of content into the exam and ultimately supporting these diverse proctoring models that we've been talking about. If you need to have the exam be one where a remote proctor can completely control that exam and shut it down if need be, internet delivery enables that model perfectly. And lastly, there's an interest in assessment diversity. We see programs across the industry saying, look, it's not a one-size-fits-all for our program anymore. We have varying factors that they might be considering, like program expansion. They have a entry-level certification, and they want to bring it into new geographies. Maybe they want to take something that is North America-based and move it internationally or vice versa. But in doing so, they need flexibility for how they encounter the candidates and how they assess them or deal with maybe what might be a smaller test center network. We also see programs wanting to do, increasingly want to go to gateway assessments. In other words, a assessment that's sort of entry level that becomes a feeder program for their main primary assessment. This is true in both professional and IT markets, where the associate level has a lot of value for both helping people assert they have real market valuable skills, but also for the program it creates a pipeline and a feeder of people who might be interested in the higher level skills and assessment. And lastly, we see programs increasingly want to offer self-assessment, different types of practice, or different types of scenarios where the stakes are really different. They're not, in a self-assessment scenario, if the candidate cheats, they're really cheating themselves. Also, in the self-assessment, you may have different sensitivities about the content itself that, than you might have with a high-stakes assessment. And overall, this is causing programs to basically, in any number of ways, look at how they expand what they offer in one of these areas I've mentioned. Let's go to the next slide. To be clear, there's a number of vendors that are playing in this space of online proctoring and record and review, and there's just actually just a smattering of them represented here. It's also true because of the way technology is advancing that over time we are seeing more players getting into this space. So some of these folks have started to have a good presence and contribution to our industry. Some of them focus on education as opposed to credentialing. The point is there's a number of vendors providing solutions. I will say there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all, and if you were to go look across all of these, they don't all do online proctoring the same way. So it means that you have to kind of consider your program's needs as you look at what you're getting with any one of these. So let's go to the next slide. So first, some general factors to consider. Obviously, when we're looking at that spectrum that I presented at the beginning of control versus access, the key question is going to be around what is the assessment and what are the stakes? And you have to start to consider questions about exam integrity and also content integrity. But if we think about the first, for example, what these new models are doing is they're still bringing some level of control and integrity to the exam, particularly cases where a live proctor is still involved. So the program has to assess, look, what level of authority am I granting when I credential someone or say they have this skill? Is it an entry-level certification that lets someone decide that they might be yet another reason why we should consider them for an employee? That's a lot different than is it a high-stakes skill that they have to assert before they can be put in life or death scenarios. And obviously that's kind of the big dichotomy, kind of an extreme example. But what we're finding is folks are looking at, well, how do they match that? And there are certainly cases where high-stakes exam sponsors are telling industry, and they're telling us, well, they would never want to bring their highest stakes content to this because they absolutely still want the highest level of control. And it's not just control over security. In other cases, it can be control over environment. If they want to ensure the second bullet point here, ensuring that the test outcomes are fair and the scores are valid, they want to be able to say that, look, nobody had a bad experience because they were on a computer that crapped out on them or that they were in an environment that was noisy. There's still, when you want the absolute kind of purest environment, that is still causes folks to gravitate more to center-based models. So that's something you have to consider. And lastly, there's a key here around the exam content itself. There is simply less control over the environment when a candidate is taking an online proctored exam, particularly if it's only record and review. I'll get to record and review for a second here, but I want to be really clear that in general, we wouldn't say, from our perspective at Pearson, we wouldn't say that we have the same amount of content protection or IP protection in remote proctoring that we do in a center-based model. And so sometimes the sponsor has to think about, well, what is my content? How valuable is my content? What did it take to create it? How often am I refreshing it? Or is the content, is it purely knowledge-based? For example, one of the things that happens is that if you can contrast a sponsor that has a large pool of knowledge-based content that is reasonably replicatable or that they're adding to every month or every quarter, that makes them a little bit more tolerant of the trade-offs here in an online proctored model. A sponsor with a small amount of very expensive content will not find this model as attractive because they can't control as well the IP protection. But another maybe way to think about it is some sponsors are finding they've got content that's more performance-based. It might be simulation, case-based. It might be things that are, in a sense, harder to cheat on because you have to know the actual content or you have to have the ability to perform the task. And there are sponsors, particularly in the IT market, that because of what they're assessing, maybe it's the ability to configure a database or use a software package, their exams are not purely knowledge-based, and to actually complete the exam, you have to use the tool. You have to use the spreadsheet tool or the drafting tool or the simulation of it. And those items, they're more tolerant to the IP protection issue because it doesn't matter if you know that you're going to have to use a spreadsheet to do the test. You still have to be able to actually have that skill. Anyways, I've kind of talked a little bit about that at length. I think that the rest of this is just really, do you want to do the test solution integrated with the rest of your testing program, either with your current vendor or with your current operations? In some cases, that's not necessary. In other cases, that's really valuable. And lastly is geographical coverage and the hours that you want to support. If you're doing online proctoring, there's still a human proctor involved. And you need to just be aware of some of the issues that are associated with geography and hours. I'll go into geography for a second, but was there a point you wanted to add, Clarke?
You know, one of the themes I'm hearing you really focus on and that I think people need to think about pretty carefully is where they are on that security continuum. So you've talked about it as a lot of control to a lot of access being a continuum, but this particular point you're making now is, well, how important is security to your program? What are the stakes? What are the risks if something goes wrong? I mean, you think about it, before we license a physician, you know, they've taken a lot of multiple choice tests, they've had to practice, they frequently go before a board because, you know, the stakes are really high, so they do a lot of assessing and testing. So they're really at the high end of the security and security continuum because the stakes are high. Like I've always used my example, do you want a brain surgeon that only took a multiple choice test to qualify? Probably not. But, you know, one of the things that occurs here to me, and I don't know if it's part of anyone's model, is can all of these, I'll say these cost-effective methods, because, you know, obviously all these computer delivery online methods are more cost-effective than maybe appearing in person and spending days or weeks getting assessed by a panel, for example. Could we combine these? I mean, could you do it at a test center, have remote proctoring, and have record and review to kind of look at all the different ways that we might try to up the protection but still say pretty flexible? Do you know about any one that's combining all the different methods into one solution?
I think one example of that, it doesn't necessarily relate yet to online proctoring specifically, but is what the Australian Medical Council is doing, where they're blending the assessment of their kind of knowledge and the basic high-stakes exam that you sit for with a OSCE or an observational clinical evaluation, where the candidate goes through a simulation with simulated patients, actors playing the patients, and observers or raters, and basically bringing together kind of multiple forms of assessment. I think that we have started to talk about interview assessments or cases where you would do support. Can you use these online tools to support just geographically distributed interviews and online oral exams? That's actually still new, and it's somewhat. I would say that the technology is catching up, but I think what we've been solving first, and what other vendors have been solving, quite frankly, as well, is the standard assessment approach first. I think that's in our future, though, particularly because it's going to be harder and harder to ship people around the globe to perform assessments. I think the observing and rating a task is one thing through remote tools, because you could use mobile devices to capture candidates' performance, say in an oral exam or performing a task, and rate it after the fact. I think the harder challenge for us is, as an industry, is when the task involves using some specialized software like a lab-based environment. That I would say really is pushing the cutting edge of the envelope right now because of how hard it is to reliably configure and scale the lab-based stuff. But I think you'll see all of that kind of coming together in our future, and as with the Australian example, already some synergies.
So really the work the industry is doing across all these vendors to build out the infrastructure for online proctoring, there's probably a lot of ways we can package that and use it for different flavors of assessment.
Right.
So it's a little, I would say from my personal experience in observing the industry evolve, it's not a at-scale service yet, online proctoring, but there are so many people playing in it now that we're really driving to get there, and it's really, of course, the clients, the people on this call that sponsor tests that are going to help drive that by adopting these sort of techniques so that the infrastructure will build out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool.
I think what I would add to that is that if you go back a few years, standard assessment models were very well understood. Online proctoring was sort of the edge and the unknown, and needed a lot of technology investment, and we weren't sure how it would scale. You fast forward, and these remote rating and distributed observers, that wasn't even on the radar.
Yep.
I think if you fast forward to today, we understand online proctoring much better. And I think a number of other vendors believe we know how to make this scale now. We're ready to start that process. Mm-hmm. But the online rating and distributed performance-based testing, that's still more of that's the future. Just like that's in the future, just like online proctoring was in the future 4 years ago. Yeah. So I see it as a progression.
And I do think next month we have Carrie Duvall coming from Microsoft. She's going to give kind of a real-life use case and some of their experiences doing it. So I think that'll be an interesting practical example following up sort of this theoretical inspection of our options.
Yeah, absolutely.
But sorry to derail you from your next slide.
No, that's okay. There's only a few more slides. So one last thing I'll say about this geographical coverage point is there's actually a lot hidden here in one single bullet point. I debated whether I should expand this into a separate slide. In either of the models that we've talked about, whether it's online proctoring with a live proctor or record and review, you're taking video of the candidate performing the test. And geographically, we find, and the sponsors find, that there's a wide variety in data privacy laws across the globe that have to be factored into the solution. Now, we've done a lot of investigation of the specific legal issues and requirements country by country, and we have our own interpretation, but ultimately the sponsor has to make their own assessment. The credentialing sponsor makes their own assessment about where they want to be and whether they're compatible. In some cases, it just means that in certain geographies, you cannot hold on to video as long as other geographies. Yeah. And vendors can support that. But in other cases, it means that it's rather tricky to get the complete compliance with the local privacy laws. So it's something that you'd want to ask your vendor about and know that that's something that gets evaluated as you look at the solution.
Yeah, Peter, that's a good point. I've been so much a pie-in-the-sky thinker on this topic. I haven't really gotten down to the brass tacks. But all of us are in the IT field here because this is the ITCC, and we're a very global organization. So when you do form your strategy for utilizing this online proctoring infrastructure, you're going to have to carefully investigate how you will roll that out and what geographies, because there are some that may completely prohibit doing this sort of monitoring. So that is a really important point. It might not be as uniform as you want it where you could offer the service, but you'll definitely need to figure that out.
And I think that's something that will be in the Microsoft session. At least you'll hear them talk about their experience with this, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide. So a second area that you want to look at beyond how is your assessment structured is the candidate experience that you're targeting. To be clear with these models, there are specific device requirements. What we're finding is technology is catching up. So most laptops, even within the last 3 years, have embedded webcams that are suitable for this. But you do have to keep in mind the nature of your candidate population. Do they have access to these machines, or do they have them themselves? Or can they be in an environment where they have them? Second of all, just being aware of either the requirements for different OSs, internet connectivity, and the candidate's ability to download at least a secure browser for their system. Or in other cases, vendors do this by having you download an app, let's say, for example, if you wanted to do tablet-based testing. In many cases, the candidates have control over their machine, their environment, so this isn't a problem, but it's something that has to be factored in. So some final points listed here. It's a good idea to review the testing workflow for any vendor that you're working with or that you're getting information from, because that'll help you see kind of the differences between the apples to oranges in terms of how the candidate experience work, how launching an exam works. And that'll kind of lead into this next point, understanding the ease of use, how smooth the solution is, and how robust the solution is for tolerating disruptions, whether that be internet connection goes down or the candidate needs to take a break. Finally, each vendor or solution is going to have a different answer for how the end user registers and pays for exams and how they get support when they have issues. So just factors that you should be looking at and comparing. Go to the next slide. Another area to consider, how proctoring occurs. And this goes back again to the proctored versus record and review. Is there always a live proctor? And what is the proctor to candidate ratio? This can really range, and various vendors are also bringing technology into the solution to positively influence this. In other words, allow proctors to proctor more candidates with the same amount of reliability, doing things like facial recognition. Multiple vendors out there can detect whether a second person has entered the frame who may just be in the room but may be helping the candidate with the test, and we don't want that. Other technical tricks that are employed, some vendors have the ability to do facial detection or facial recognition and check that it's the same candidate seated throughout the exam. In other words, that they didn't hit a section and pull in a buddy to finish the exam for them. So those are some of the technical factors that are out there that influence proctor to candidate ratio. You also want to consider what control the proctor has over the exam delivery experience. So in most cases, if there is a live proctor who's watching the exam remote, they have the ability to communicate with the candidate and shut down the experience. The candidate proctor experience is kind of also important to consider. This is how the candidate interacts with the proctor, and some of this will be related to the proctoring protocol you choose. In other words, most systems afford you some flexibility. I'll give you an example. You can elect to, as part of the startup process of the exam, you can elect to take a photo of the candidate and a photo of an ID. You could also decide that you're only going to take a photo of the candidate. You need to just sort of consider what aspects you want within your launch protocol. And as folks have moved from a center-based model to this, they tend to want a higher degree of control in the protocol that gives them more security, capturing IDs and candidate photos, for example. Folks that are migrating from unproctored exams tend to strive for a lighter touch protocol because they don't need the control. Language support is key, particularly in this startup experience. And I know, at least Pearson VUE, we've been looking at what languages do we need to support to effectively guide the candidate through this process. Obviously, you'll see in a lot of cases, and even for us, the bulk of our operational support is all centered entirely around English, but we're starting to explore, as others in the market are, what languages do we need to offer to be effective in this? And maybe lastly, what does a proctor see and what do some of their tools look like? You can often find that the vendors will demo their proctor management, proctor console, so you get a sense for the control that's going into the exam. And lastly, you might want to be reviewing what is recorded, what's sent back, what audit capabilities do you have? Do you have the ability to request video? How long is that video held for? In certain cases, you may want to be able to have the ability to review that yourself as opposed to making that only the vendor's responsibility. Now, a thing to point out here that you may be seeing at this point, there's a lot of technology involved. I talked about facial recognition. I talked about online proctoring, voice over IP, and so on, storing video and making it available. There's also still a lot of labor involved, particularly if you want to favor more of the actual proctored model over record and review. So one of the things that we try to remind candidates, or sponsors interested in these tools is the higher that you go in setting the needle on how much control you want, how much security you want, you're going to drive up things like technology cost and drive up labor usage, which will change the cost dynamics of the solution. It can be a solution that has the same cost profile as center-based because you have the same amount of labor and technology employed, but what you're getting instead is flexibility and access for the candidate. In other cases, you could drive down the needle towards access, and you can say that you're just going to do record and review, and you can eliminate a lot of that labor and that labor cost. You give up the control, but you end up with a lower cost solution. So those are things that are present in the solution, but I want to sort of disavow folks of the notion that it's always cheaper. It is not always cheaper when you want all of the same control baked back in, human proctors and a lot of technology. So look at the last slide, and this is around test security and integrity. And some of this I mentioned shows up in the launch protocols for an exam. You can decide, how much verification for the identity are you going to do? How robust is it? Can the vendor compare photos taken of that candidate with a photo taken of the candidate in previous exam sessions? That's a very nice feature to have from an identity management perspective. Are verification procedures auditable? Can the vendor talk to you about the protocols that they use and how they provide reports about compliance to those protocols, particularly when you're in this higher control scenario? How is content secured? This is a great open discussion that you should be having with the vendor. What are the risks? How is cheating detected and prevented? What are the things that the proctors are looking for? What are they trained to look for? And what happens when they note those things. In some scenarios, there are some vendors provide kind of a tiered level of proctoring where a proctor can pass a candidate to up to a sort of a supervising security manager when they think that there's an issue. So there's ways that for kind of vendors to provide kind of layers of control, and you definitely want to understand how that's working. And lastly, what data is available for reporting and analytics around the solution. And I think you'll find that you can get some basic information about what's happening, but in a lot of cases, vendors have made their first investments in the delivery technology. And my goal would be to see vendors partnering with programs to figure out what makes the most sense to be providing from a data and analytics perspective. We see some parallels with test center delivery, but we see some cases where there's just whole new sets of information that might be useful. So that kind of concludes our formal presentation, leaving a few minutes for questions here.
Hey, 11 minutes. That's a lot.
Thoughts and questions from the audience?
This is Chuck. I guess from my point of view, at least as we've looked at the possibilities of moving to this, it would be more for Clarke's, Montana example, or Wyoming, wherever it was, but, where we don't have coverage with a site and we need to be able to provide the test. As a result, it really does require that the full capabilities of the secure browser and lockdown platform and everything else are maintained. Is there any, downside to that assumption, or is that just part of the way you'd configure your online proctoring environment?
I think, well, I'll offer my perspective. I think you should ask for an experience report next month from Microsoft. My first reaction is, if this isn't we don't expect this to be a big problem. We're asking folks to download and use a secure browser that to date for us has not been hard for people to install. They can confirm up front through a basic system check that they can get available, before they even decide to register for the exam. They can confirm whether they have a system that does this, that supports the delivery. But it is a very important question you raise, because obviously we're still making an assumption that we can place this demand on folks, and we think it's an important demand, but we would, we want to monitor this over time. I think that you hear from other folks in the industry, other vendors in particular, that this hasn't been a problem for them. To say that you have to have this downloadable secure browser to deliver the tests, it hasn't been a barrier to getting adoption. But let's, re-ask that question again, because you're on to a key point here.
Yeah, again, the point, I think, to sum it up, is a lot of what you talked about earlier is this can fit nicely into the low and medium stakes, and our target is very specifically exclusively high stakes and as a backfill for missing centers, and therefore we jump right from a looser environment to needing every aspect of the secure environment. So I'll bring this up next month.
There's two other things to think about when you do this. One of the things I know some sponsors are experimenting with is where an exam is available in both models. It's available in a center, but it's also available remotely, and starting to look at, and this again is specifically something Microsoft can speak to, but starting to look at what factors are causing people to choose one over the other. Is it our Montana-based kind of example candidates? I think the one thing that we can't forget is that let's say the adoption rate goes, I don't know, let's just say it's 50-50 even. One of the things that we have to be aware of is that while we may have reduced the amount of candidates that are taking it purely remote proctored by having a center-based option, that reduces our exposure to, it reduces the number of people who could be using kind of home-based cheating methods. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't eliminate it, and particularly the thing that we think is most important is it changes the way your content is secured. So even if adoption rate, frankly, was only 10% of remote proctored, and the other 90% took it in the center, the 10% of people have a slightly different, lower controlled environment through which they might be able to compromise the content, and that's something that we're all very concerned about. We want to monitor that impact. But again, some programs are making that as a trade-off, or because they have certain aspects of the assessment that lets them make that as a trade-off.
Right. Thank you.
Well, thank you for raising a good point. Other questions or comments? We must have been incredibly clear. Good thing, Clarke, you clarified the models in the middle. That actually was really useful.
Well, thanks, everybody. I guess if there aren't any more questions, we'll close for today. I appreciate everyone joining the tutorial on online proctoring, a.k.a. remote proctoring.
Real good session. I think it did a real nice job of laying out a vendor-neutral view of the topic, so good job. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Chuck. Make sure you let Michael know that we honored our deal.
Yeah.
Yep.
Take care, everybody.
And this
Stay warm.
this recording will be posted on the website along with the slides.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.